let's talk about the profound impact that colonization had in Sub-Saharan Africa. By the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution was well underway in Europe. There was an increased demand for mineral resources to fund it, and Africa was rich in those resources. There was a need to expand agricultural production in various portions of the globe, since many Europeans were no longer farming as much as they had previously, and there was a need to increase and expand marketplaces for manufactured goods that were being produced in Europe. Europe sees colonization of the African subcontinent as a way to achieve these goals. Now, competition grows heated for various portions of Africa. The borders between individual colonies become unclear, and so in 1884, they convene the Berlin Conference. 14 European states divide up Africa, and when they do so without any consideration for existing cultures or existing state boundaries. By the time 1900 rolls around, you can see on our map that most of the control of these areas had been acquired. While you're looking at this map, note too that we don't really see colonization depart from the African subcontinent until 1994. So let's talk about the impacts of the Berlin Conference. As a result of these imposed political boundaries from these colonies, there's really no concession made for existing ethnic boundaries. You can note on our map here that we have a large number of ethnic homelands in Africa, and you'll see those white lines that indicate existing states in Africa, which are really the boundaries of some of these former colonies. So African peoples are divided, unified regions are ripped apart, hostile societies are often thrown together, and in fact, many colonies actually use this as a tool to maintain control, because if you keep people fighting against each other, of course it keeps them from fighting against their colonizing overlords. So this is excellent if you want to maintain control. You get core areas and hinterlands that are disrupted. So this disrupts economies, because now you're interrupting systems of exchange between rural and urban areas. You're interrupting migration routes. You're closing those off, so pastoral herding routes are obstructed. Trading routes are closed off. Again, disrupting economies. By the time independence finally starts to return to Africa in the 1950s and finally is completed by the 1990s, the realm has acquired this legacy of political, cultural, and economic fragmentation. So let's dig into that a little deeper. If we look at the colonial policies pursued by the big four colonizers, we have Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium, and those policies are a little bit different in each individual area. Great Britain has colonies in places like Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and they pursue a policy that we refer to as indirect rule. Indirect rule leaves indigenous power structures intact to some degree. That is, you're leaving local rulers in place and making them direct representatives of the crown itself. In France, who have colonies in Senegal, in Mali, in the Ivory Coast, which is also known as Côte d'Ivoire, you have much more assimilationist policies. These enforce direct rule, which propagates French culture. So the goal here is to abolish local culture and customs and to establish French language, French laws, French education systems, French modes of dress in these locations. You can see from our photo here that you're looking at young people who have been forced to acculturate to a French style of dress. They really want their colonies to be French in every way. The Portuguese have colonies in Guinea-Bissau, in Angola, in Mozambique, and they pursue a policy of really hardcore exploitation. They maintain very brutal and rigid control of their colonies. They're very raw, resource-oriented. The Portuguese are the first to enslave and colonize, really one of the last colonies to grant independence. The Belgians have colonies in Rwanda and Burundi, in places like Zaire, and they have a much more paternalistic attitude that they pursue in their colonies. They really treat Africans as though they're children who need to be tutored in Western way. They don't really try to make them Belgian. They really don't believe that they're capable of high enough order thinking to become Belgian. They're raw resource oriented, and they really ignore the development of natives. In all cases here, you're looking at colonial groups that are ignoring the infrastructural development of their colonies, and they're very focused on extracting resources out of these locations for the benefit of the mother colony. So what is the legacy then? Well, in the 1970s, you're still looking at states who are maintaining colonies in Africa. For example, in 1970, Portugal has control of colonies in Angola and in Mozambique. The United Kingdom still has Zimbabwe. It's not until the mid-1990s that all areas of Africa finally become independent. So spend a few moments considering how difficult the first 50 years of U.S. history was for our own country and how unstable we were. Does it seem so strange then that many countries on this continent would struggle with instability given their youth? Now consider the extenuating factors I'm about to share with you. For example, several hundred languages are spoken on this continent, and yet there are only 54 countries. The area I'm showing you in the map here includes Ghana, Togo, and Benin within West Africa. If you'll look at our larger continental map, that's that area circled in red. And yet, if you look at our map that shows languages, each of these areas in green is a different language group. That's a lot of languages spoken even within, say, the country of Ghana itself. Language is one of the key features to culture, so that then implies there are several hundred cultures found within the continent of Africa. That means you have highly multinational states. Consider the difficulties involved in meeting the goals and needs of every cultural group within a single state. It's tough. We also find that there's still leftover antagonism between tribes or social classes. A really excellent example of this is Rwanda. And often this antagonism really is a leftover due to colonial actions. If we look at the Rwandan genocide in early 1994, we see that. If you go back in history, you'll find that the Hutu and the Tutsi people, who make up the vast majority of the cultures found in Rwanda, lived in relative peace with each other. Again, in about 1400 AD, you're looking at this lovely reciprocal cooperative exchange between Hutu and Tutsi people. Hutus were a relatively warlike group of people, and they protected the Tutsis, who were peaceful farmers, in exchange for their agricultural products. And this worked out really well for both groups. But when Europeans came into this area, they didn't really understand that these were separate cultures. They really perceived them as two separate social classes. And so under German and then consequently Belgian colonization, they really perceived them as being two separate social divisions. They perceived the Tutsi as being an elite upper ruling class, and they put them into positions of greater social power. Well, that, of course, spiked a great deal of resentment among Hutu people. And so when the Belgians withdrew and you began to see Rwanda develop its independence, there were violent reprisals against the ruling Tutsi class. Rwanda itself would become an area that the Hutu people would take over. Burundi would be an area that the Tutsis would flee to. In a period of just over 100 days, we would see a genocide where somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed. Only 300,000 Tutsis survived this genocide. Additionally, another legacy of colonialism that we see is a very low level of development. Again, these colonies were very exploitation-based. There was no development or investment in the infrastructure unless it related to extracting resources from that environment. So certainly colonial powers would invest in transportation facilities if we were moving goods from the interior to coastal locations, So we would see maybe highways developed that moved goods to ports, and we would see ports developed. But there were no good networks developed for trading in regional areas. Communication networks were never well established, and these were impeded by natural barriers. Public infrastructure itself, whether it's poor roads or telephone networks or utilities, were never developed in much of sub-Saharan Africa as a result. We also find that the dual economy remains intact. The economy is not well integrated. There's really two economies that exist throughout sub-Saharan Africa. There's one economy for cash production on the global market, which is known as the formal sector, and this cash production is taxed and helps fund one's state infrastructure. And then there's another informal sector that takes care of local needs. So you might find that a street vendor who is probably not paying taxes is participating in the informal sector, or an individual who is a squatter on land and has a shack there and is not paying taxes on that shack is probably participating in the informal sector. We also find, when we look at the African economy, that it is, again, not oriented towards trade with other states within sub-Saharan Africa, but it's really oriented toward global export. And they still are strongly reliant on their economic relationship that they have developed historically with those mother colonies, which makes them very vulnerable to world markets. There's little manufacturing industry that's going on here. We're looking at countries that are primarily agricultural nations or nations based on extracting mineral resources out of the environment. So when we look at the legacy of colonialism here, we find that the collective colonization of the African subcontinent has created an area in Western Europe that has become one of the most developed regions in the world, while this realm is the least developed region in the world. We have ethnic groups that are fragmented among multiple countries and suffer civil wars at a much greater rate due to their divisions. We find economies that have been very severely disrupted. We find infrastructure is, in some cases, as much as 100 years behind other countries. But times are changing. This is also an area that is undergoing heavy development. The economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa has outperformed all other realms for the last 20 years running, as companies are extracting natural resources from the environment. And in particular, we find China has worked hard to develop strong trade relationships with various African countries. So things are looking up. There's a lot of hope in this particular realm.